The Delphine Painting is allegedly one of the most haunted paintings in the world. It's said to have caused so much terror and supernatural phenomenon, the current owner has it locked away in an unknown location to protect people. Which I guess is good, because a demon is said to be attached to this painting. That could be an abusive slave owner from long, long ago named Delphine LaLaurie. Accounts state that those who view the painting are overcome with some sort of darkness. Their chest becomes knotted and heavy as unsettling emotions fester within their psyche. Those who look upon the Delphine painting are never the same. Madame Delphine LaLaurie was a well-known social butterfly in the early 19th century, located in New Orleans. Born into a wealthy aristocratic family, she indulged in a lavish and decadent lifestyle. The Madame loved to host parties with all the most popular and famous aristocratic people of the time in attendance. So she was very well known and famous in her community for the most part. However, her reputation was about to change. A kitchen fire broke out in Madame Delphine's patrician home, and the inferno spread quickly. Some who witnessed the fire ran into the mansion bravely in an attempt to save the occupants. The LaLaurie were owners of many slaves who were locked inside the house. This was well known. People intent on rescuing the innocent slave families asked Delphine for the keys to go get them. But the Madame refused them in a gross and insulting manner. Appalled by this, the bystanders ignored any more of the cruel woman's protests and kicked down the doors to the slave apartments. What they found was even worse than Madame Delphine's lack of interest for her slaves' safety, and was described as too incredible for human belief. There were torture dens that modern horror movie gore porn seems soft when in comparison to. There were 7 people discovered that were horribly mutilated, decaying corpses protruding from a hole in the floor, and some victims had been hung from the ceiling, their skin flayed, ripped and pulled wide and thin. They found those with the limbs that were torn off and stretched in grotesque ways. The slaves hardly resembled anything human at all. Many were in very painful positions, iron-spiked collars forced on their necks, greatly reducing their head mobility. There were slaves who had their backs ripped and torn from countless thrashings, leaving the leathery scar tissue protruding, and in some cases bones visibly poking out. Here's a quote from one of the witnesses.
Language is powerless and inadequate to give a proper conception of the horror which a scene like this must have inspired.
Later, it was revealed that the fire had been started on purpose. The household cook was chained extremely close to a blazing hot fire, and in a moment of despair, the cook concluded that it was better that they all burned together than suffer under Madame LaLaurie's sadistic torment any longer. It must have been a miserable existence beyond comprehension to prefer burning to death over living another day. How horrible must a person be for someone to want to burn alive in order to avoid them? This lady was, indeed, a demon in human form. The Madame had a reputation for grace and high culture among the upper-class socialites of New Orleans. Despite her classy persona, there were some who had suspected hidden secrets of a malevolent nature concerning the slave owner. Her neighbors had spotted tortured slaves on occasion, and they found the appearance of these slaves quite repulsive. A local lawyer had even warned Madame LaLaurie that if evidence was found that she'd been performing illegal cruel treatment upon her slaves, then they'd be confiscated from her and resold by the state. However, nothing seemed to be able to stop the Madame and her sick, twisted desires. A neighbor once saw Delphine LaLaurie chase a child girl with a cow whip across her property. The horrified woman gazed in astonishment as the madame chased the girl all the way to the roof, cracking her with the whip as they went. Instead of facing her deranged mistress, though, the child committed suicide by jumping off the roof. The neighbor later saw the girl's body being buried in a shallow grave in the corner of the yard like someone might do with a dead cat. So this lady was seriously messed up. It's so dark to think that death would be better than the madame's punishment. But yeah, probably was. Her servants said that after breakfast, she'd flog slaves until she couldn't anymore as a form of exercise. It all seems like a story from a horror movie, but no. This all very much happened. Over 100 years later, skulls and bones were still being found randomly on the ruins of the madame's property. How people didn't stop this insane slave master sooner is beyond me. In her mind, the inflicting of intense physical pain and mutilation upon those she deemed her property was completely normal. After the fire, when the madame was confronted for her grotesque treatment of the slaves, she couldn't even comprehend that she'd done anything wrong. Not soon after, Delphine LaLaurie was chased out of town by an angry mob. She fled to France for sanctuary, unable to understand why the people of New Orleans had turned against her. Her home and property were destroyed by the vengeful mob, her name becoming synonymous with cruelty and evil. Delphine LaLaurie died in exile, living the rest of her life in quiet seclusion and never being brought to justice for her crimes against humanity. Centuries later, the madame's former property was renovated in the 1970s, where apartments were built. In 1997, the owners of the property where the torture mansion once stood commissioned a painting of the historical Madame LaLaurie. Why they would do this, or if they knew about the Madame's macabre legacy, isn't known. But when it was done, the painting was hung up for display, and I'm sure you can guess what happened from there. Rumors began to spread by people who had witnessed the painting. In fact, everyone who glanced at the painting seemed affected by it, whether they knew who the woman in the painting was or not. However, once hung upon the wall, ghost sightings also became frequent within the apartments. Shadowy apparitions were seen walking the halls and within people's individual apartments. But one dark entity above all became prominent after the portrait was placed in the building. And this entity is most associated with the supernatural encounters concerning the Delphine painting. According to some, it's the soul of Madame LaLaurie herself. Others have claimed it's a demon, though the most interesting speculation is that the entity is an amalgamation of the tortured slaves who died by the Madame's hand, manifesting as a single entity. Maybe all three could be true, who knows? But reports of supernatural activity were common in the building back before the painting was removed. And while it was there, it allegedly rocked and moved violently on its own, falling to the floor, and pierced the mind of any who looked upon it. People reported voices coming from nowhere, cold touches, objects moving on their own, whispers in the darkness that would speak people's names, and ghostly footsteps up and down the halls. The artist who painted the portrait said that he never intended such darkness to be attached to his painting and had no supernatural occurrences while he was painting it. He even made other versions of the portrait of Madame LaLaurie, with none of them ever showing any signs of paranormal activity. Today the painting is locked away and unable to view. The private collector is mysterious and not able to be tracked down.